Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we are traveling back more than 4,000 years to the land of ancient Egypt, stripping away all that museum gold to uncover the grueling reality of everyday life. Out here, there are no busy streets, no engines, absolutely no electricity, and no glowing screens. To truly grasp what built this civilization, we have to look right past the grand pharaohs and step directly into the mud.
Imagine the first light of dawn beginning to appear over the Nile. The stars are fading, the eastern sky is turning pale orange, and the air is cool for just a short while before the harsh desert sun starts to bake the land. Inside a small, practical home built of mud bricks, a family wakes up on woven reed mats. There are no clocks to hurry anyone. The rising sun just tells everyone that the daily struggle has to begin. Breakfast is incredibly simple. They're having basic bread, maybe a few onions or dates, and weak beer. Now, you might be wondering, beer for breakfast? Well, because clean drinking water just wasn't reliably available, that weak grain-based beer was actually way safer to drink than untreated river water. It just goes to show how survival was this constant, calculated effort from the literal second they opened their eyes.
As the morning grows brighter, smoke rises gently from cooking fires, and neighbors quietly greet each other before heading to the fields. We tend to picture this serene, highly polished civilization, maybe smelling of sweet temple incense and fresh river breezes. But the sensory reality of stepping out your door on this ancient morning was, well, drastically different from what you might expect.
There is this sheer, jarring contrast between the pristine temples and the ordinary streets. When researchers look at ancient texts, including a ceremonial hymn written for King Ramesses VI, they found that one of his very first royal duties was to rid the land of a swampy, foul stench. And no wonder, the streets were completely plagued by the reek of rotting fish, garbage, and livestock. People kept animals, like goats and pigs, right inside their densely packed settlements. Throw in butchered carcasses and a total lack of modern plumbing, and you get an odor profile that modern researchers compare to a mix of rancid oil, ripe cheese, and heavy, heavy human sweat.
Section 1. Mud, sweat, and endless seasons. As that hot sun rises higher and the whole village gets to work, the relentless cycle of physical exertion kicks in, completely dictated by the river.
Life for these people was a grueling agricultural cycle, strictly split into 3 4-month seasons. First up was Aket, the flooding season that dropped all that rich soil. Then came Peret, the growing season where livestock literally trampled the seeds down into the mud. And finally Shemu, the brutally hot, dry harvesting season. For the average worker, this meant absolutely back-breaking labor. We're talking plowing fields with oxen all day long, or hauling massive amounts of water manually on their shoulders using heavy wooden yokes, just trying to keep the crops alive.
And the thing is, when they weren't farming, they were building. So forget the gleaming stone pyramids for a second. The true foundation of this entire society was mud. Looking at early archaeological digs, we see basic wattle and daub fences, which are basically woven sticks packed with mud, eventually getting replaced by solid mud brick walls. Ordinary people really had zero use for stone architecture. Every single home, every workshop, every massive settlement wall was shaped directly from Nile mud, mixed with sand organic material, and formed into bricks by the working class.
And the amount of time this took is just staggering. It took a full week just to dry these mud bricks out in the sun. During that entire week, workers had to manually flip those heavy, wet bricks over and over again so they wouldn't crack. Plus, you have to remember that during the flood season, dry land was incredibly scarce. Laying out thousands of bricks to dry ate up massive amounts of the extremely limited, flood-safe space they had inside their packed villages.
This grueling labor extended right into their daily diet, too. Remember that weak beer they needed for breakfast just to stay hydrated safely? Producing enough of it required immense communal manufacturing efforts. At excavated sites like Tel El Farka, we found massive ancient breweries containing 13 vats capable of producing 200 liters of beer at once. Sustaining the population's basic hydration required monumental labor and heavy industrial-scale mud brick infrastructure.
Section 2. The invisible laboring majority. Behind all these massive building and agricultural projects was a deeply impoverished population that barely gets a spotlight.
For decades, archaeology focused so heavily on the elite, leaving the poor largely in the shadows. But this invisible workforce was the true engine of Egypt. And we absolutely cannot talk about this without highlighting the women. Women were the backbone of survival here. They managed a relentless daily checklist, grinding rough grain by hand to bake bread, brewing that essential beer, weaving garments, sweating out in the agricultural fields, managing stores and trading at the local markets along the Nile. They even served as professional mourners. They were far from invisible in daily life. Their constant heavy labor literally held these communities together.
Children were swept right into this rhythm too. Now, childhood was a real thing. They definitely had dolls and board games, but it wasn't walled off from the harsh realities of survival like a modern childhood is. Kids lived right alongside the adult work. From a very young age, they were fetching water, tending to the animals, and working the fields. They learned by doing, fully integrated into the village's labor force the moment they were able.
And speaking of the animals, families had to constantly manage livestock that lived right inside their courtyards. And this wasn't just tossing some feed to the chickens. This involved domesticating herds, going out to capture wild poultry in nets, and literally force-feeding ducks and geese with balls of dough by hand just to fatten them up. Maintaining their precarious food supply meant that every single calorie consumed required intense physical output to produce.
Section 3. Sickness, Survival, and Sunset. As the hot afternoon wears on, this non-stop physical exertion takes a massive, compounding toll on the human body. So, what happens when this biological machine breaks down?
Well, astonishingly, written records and skeletal remains from places like Deir al-Medina show these ancient laborers actually had a system of paid sick leave. But, as Stanford scholar Ann Austin points out, they faced immense pressure to work right through their illnesses anyway. They owed so much to the state that they pushed their broken bodies to the absolute limit. It's a struggle with workplace guilt and obligation that, honestly, a lot of modern workers might find all too familiar.
Finally, the sun sets and the river darkens. But even sleep didn't mean perfect peace. The dropping temperatures of the desert night brought out dangerous insects, the very real threat of thieves, and just an overwhelming fear of the dark. Exhausted families would retreat to their mud brick homes and rely heavily on protective amulets and small spoken prayers to ward off the physical and spiritual dangers they believed were lurking outside.
But tomorrow the sun would rise and they would wake up and do it all over again. They repeated these ordinary, exhausting, mud-soaked days to build a culture that would last for millennia. Ancient Egypt's longevity isn't just about the brilliance of its elite architects, it's about the sheer, undeniable endurance of millions of regular days held together by sweat and routine.
It leaves us with a deeply humbling thought. We love to travel to museums and marvel at the gold masks and the towering stone pyramids. But what this explainer has shown us is that it was the staggering resilience of the ordinary, mud-covered worker, waking up every single morning to grind grain and haul water, that truly made Egypt immortal. So I leave you with this question to ponder. Stripped of the romance and the gold, could you have survived a single day in the mud of ancient Egypt?
Welcome to this explainer. You know, when we think of ancient Egypt, our minds almost instantly go to the gold, the glamour, the monumental pyramids. But today, we're diving past all of that to uncover the gritty, everyday reality of an ancient Egyptian farming family. We're going to explore why life was so exceptionally difficult for the ordinary people who actually built this incredible civilization. So, what was life actually like for them? Imagine an existence entirely centered on the muddy banks of the Nile. For almost every family, farming wasn't just a job, it was the absolute center of their lives. The rich, dark soil right along the river was incredibly precious, especially when you compare it to the endless, unforgiving desert stretching out just beyond the valley. Section 1. The Rhythm of the River. Let's start at dawn, where the rhythm of the river literally dictated whether an entire village would survive or starve. Because the Nile flooded for 4 straight months every single year, families had to be incredibly smart about where they lived. They built these densely packed mud brick houses on elevated natural sand hills called turtlebacks, or jaziras. It's brilliant, really. They built their crowded, bustling settlements up high just to keep their homes from washing away when the waters rose. This annual flood cycle defined their entire universe. It broke the year into 3 4-month seasons that dictated every single action they took. First up was She, the flooding season. When the waters finally backed off, they left behind a precious layer of dark, fertile mud. Next came Sha'et, the winter growing season, and finally Pirouette, the blisteringly hot, dry season for harvesting. Without that natural gift of fertile mud, there was absolutely no harvest. I mean, rain almost never falls there. And without a harvest, no bread. And without bread, life becomes unimaginably difficult. Everything relied on this quiet, relentless rhythm. Plant, water, wait, harvest. Then begin again. Some years brought abundant crops and celebrations, but other years brought smaller floods and massive uncertainty, where every single grain of wheat became a matter of life and death. Section 2. Tools of the Trade. As the morning sun climbs higher into the sky and the village slowly quiets down, the brutal reality of physical labor sets in. A farmer starts his day early, well before the strongest heat of the day arrives. And remember, there are no engines, no tractors, no machines whatsoever. Imagine standing there. Sure, birds are singing from the reeds, insects are buzzing quietly, maybe there's a light breeze, but you are enduring back-breaking work. They relied entirely on human muscle, using counterweighted tools like the shadoof to haul water on their shoulders with heavy yokes, just to painstakingly fill small irrigation channels dug into the earth. Down in the dirt, the tools were just as basic. We're talking winnowing scoops, mattocks, and flint-bladed sickles passed down for generations. While some fields had wooden plows pulled by oxen, those plows were so simple they barely even scratched the surface of the soil. The rest? Prepared entirely by hand, requiring insane patience and steady effort. The big takeaway here is just how slow and demanding this work actually was. Every single seed was planted with the utmost care. Every row was created by human hands. This was a civilization built on sheer physical endurance. Section 3. A family effort. Let's move into the afternoon, where survival required the absolute cooperation of the entire family and the broader community. Life depended on cooperation. No family could succeed completely alone. While the men handled the heavy field work, like plowing and hauling water, women and older children were right nearby helping out. Women were the absolute backbone of the household economy, processing food, weaving, working the markets, and doing agricultural work. Kids would gather vegetables, carry baskets, and pull weeds. Every single person contributed. Now here's a surprising fact that I find totally fascinating. Ancient Egyptian women had a ton of legal independence compared to other ancient cultures. They could buy and inherit property, represent themselves in court, and own their own businesses. They even had the right to initiate a divorce and were legally entitled to a third of their marital property. They were a central, powerful force. As for the kids, childhood was a distinct phase. They had dolls and board games, but they lived very close to the adult work. Children watched carefully as their parents worked in the fields. Little by little, they learned the skills they'd eventually need to care for their own families. Education didn't come from books. It came from observation, practice, and getting your hands dirty right alongside your parents. Section 4. The Scent of Survival. By mid-afternoon, the sun grows incredibly strong, and the sensory experience of this labor would have been totally overwhelming. Farmers would pause only briefly for a drink and a simple meal of bread, onions, or dried fish. But the glaring blue sky and heat wasn't the only overwhelming thing. It was the smell. We actually have an ancient text, a hymn written for Ramses VI, literally begging the pharaoh to rid the land of a swampy stench. The marshes around the Nile absolutely reeked of stagnant water, fish, and birds. And this gives us a really cool look into their mindset. To the ancient Egyptians, bad smells weren't just annoying or gross. They were practically equated with evil and cosmic disorder. So fighting back that swampy stench wasn't just a basic farming chore. It was seen as a literal battle against chaos itself. Section 5. Beyond the Pharaohs. As the afternoon sunlight softens and dusk finally approaches, the relentless pace of the day begins to slow down, letting us see the bigger picture. Historically, archaeology has spent a lot of time focusing on the highly visible elite, the folks who owned large herds and built monumental stone tombs. But the invisible poor are the ones who truly sustained Egypt. They lived in those crowded mud brick houses and fueled a massive economy through their daily barter of grain, fish, cloth, and manual labor. To them, wealth wasn't shiny coins, it was stored in jars, animals, and tools. You might be wondering, how do we actually know all this? Well, it comes down to complex archaeological and textual records. By studying the remnants of mud brick walls, waste deposits, and everyday tools left behind, archaeologists piece together the incredibly hard daily realities of these settlements. For these ordinary people walking home at dusk, religion was highly practical. Sure, they knew about the big gods like Ra or Osiris, but their daily devotion was intensely local. They prayed for physical safety, for their crops to grow, and for protection against very real daily threats, like a venomous snake in the field or whatever might be lurking in the dark of night. The daily path of the sun held massive religious meaning. Sunrise was creation, sunset was a transition into the unknown. In their world, the sacred and the ordinary constantly touched. A simple loaf of bread wasn't just calories, right? It was a meal, it was a literal wage, and it was a religious offering, all at the exact same time. As families sat cooling off on their rooftops at sunset, the Nile continued to flow beside them, calm and steady, just as it did in the morning. They knew that tomorrow, the exact same grueling work awaited them. The fields would need water, the bread would need grain, and the cycle would begin again. That simple, daily rhythm remained unchanged for generations. And those millions of ordinary, repetitive days, that's what actually held the civilization together. Which leaves us with this final, powerful thought. The towering monuments and temples may have preserved their grandest dreams, but didn't these exhausted farmers preserve the actual heartbeat of ancient Egypt? The next time you see a golden pyramid, I hope you'll remember the invisible millions whose quiet, incredibly difficult rhythm of survival actually made it all possible. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to look at one of the most famous civilizations in human history, but we're doing it through a completely different lens. We're going to look right past the glittering gold, the massive stone monuments, and the royal tombs. Instead, we're uncovering the gritty, everyday reality of ancient Egyptian life to see what it actually took to just survive. So let's dive right into this with a question that kind of challenges everything we think we know. What was life actually like for 99% of ancient Egyptians? Because, we all have these Hollywood-inspired ideas of pharaohs, mummies, and towering pyramids. But honestly, those represent just a tiny elite fraction of the population. For the vast majority, the ordinary people who actually built this civilization, daily life was a grueling test of endurance, shaped entirely by physical labor and the totally unforgiving environment of the Nile Valley. Let's break down the core illusion we have about this era. On one side, we have the myth, right? Fine white linen, golden pharaohs, and endless luxury. But on the other side, we have the reality. A working class dressed in rough cloth, living as peasants, and quite literally building their entire world from the mud up. The beauty of ancient Egypt didn't just belong to royal art. It was forged by the sweat of people whose lives were absolutely anything but glamorous. Now, unlike other parts of the Mediterranean that had, say, rainy winters and dry summers, Egypt relied entirely on the Nile River. Their calendar was strictly dictated by 3 4-month seasons. First, you had Aket, the flooding season when the river deposited its rich soil. Then came Peret, the growing season during the winter months. And finally, Shamu, the incredibly hot, dry harvesting season. The grueling rhythm of their morning work was completely at the mercy of this cycle. And because of this rigid flooding and receding cycle, the landscape only allowed for one single crop a year. Just one. Think about the immense pressure of that for a second. Every single handful of grain was valuable, because a poor harvest brought instant hunger, while a good harvest meant sheer survival. There was no safety net here. There was only the Nile. Take a look at this. Actual archaeological evidence from places like Tel El Farka reveals the harsh material reality of the survival. You won't see giant limestone blocks here. Ordinary Egyptians built their lives, their shelters, and their communities using sun-dried mud bricks. Stone architecture, that was largely reserved for the gods and the dead. For the living, to hold livestock, protect the homestead, and store food, they had to work with the mud straight from the riverbanks. But working with mud brick was incredibly labor-intensive. Experimental archaeology reveals just how much effort and planning was required just for basic shelter. Get this, to make just 100 mud bricks, workers needed to clear 13.65 square meters of precious, flood-safe space just to let them dry in the sun for a week. In a landscape totally packed with cultivated land and crowded settlements, managing this space while constantly turning the heavy, wet bricks to prevent them from cracking was a massive undertaking. And as if the sheer physical labor wasn't enough, the environment itself was overwhelming. By midday, the heat was intense, and the smellscapes of ancient Egypt were incredibly potent. In fact, odors were deeply tied to their worldview. The stench of sweat, butchered animals, and swampy fish was literally associated with Istfet, which was their concept of chaos and evil. On the flip side, Ma'at, which stood for order and justice, was associated with the sweet perfumes and scented ointments of the civilized cities. So bad smells weren't just annoying, they were actually viewed as dangerous and chaotic. Despite the intense heat, the awful smells, and the physical exhaustion, stopping just wasn't an option. researchers analyzing skeletal remains at Deir el-Medina found something pretty startling. Even though these workers technically had paid sick leave, the crushing pressure to continuously labor through physical illness was immense. As the quote says, they pushed their bodies to the absolute limit just to fulfill their obligations to the state. Part 1. Bread, beer, and the grind. Let's look at daily food production. By the time the afternoon sun begins to soften, the pleasant smell of fresh bread would drift through the village. For the people of ancient Egypt, bread was way more than just food. It was the total foundation of daily life. The grain harvested from the Nile was carefully stored in large clay jars. Then came the incredibly hard work. Inside a modest mud brick home, a woman would kneel beside a flat stone, slowly and patiently grinding dried wheat into fine flour. We are talking about hours of rocking back and forth, requiring immense strength and endurance. That flour was then mixed with water to form a simple dough, and finally baked in a clay oven heated with wood or dried reeds. Alongside the bread, another familiar drink was prepared daily: beer. But to be clear, Egyptian beer was nothing like the strong beers of today. It was a thick, mild, and lightly fermented grain beverage. It provided vital nourishment, but honestly, more importantly, it provided safe hydration. Because river water from the Nile was rarely safe to drink on its own, this lightly fermented beer became an absolute essential for everyday meals. And yes, that means it was completely normal for both adults and children to drink it. So what did a typical meal actually look like? It was incredibly simple. You had your fresh bread, onions, garlic, beans, dates, and figs, maybe a few vegetables from a nearby garden. Families living close to the Nile might also enjoy fish caught that very morning. But meat? That was far less common. Most ordinary people couldn't afford to eat beef or lamb regularly. Those were luxuries strictly reserved for festivals, religious ceremonies, or wealthy elite households. Part 2. Dusk and the evening meal. Returning home. As evening approaches, the hard edge of the day finally begins to soften. Family members return to their mud brick homes after a blistering day of work. Dust clings to their clothes, and the heat of the day has left them completely exhausted. They gather together on woven mats laid across the floor. There are no dining tables, no electric lights, only the gentle glow of small oil lamps flickering against the mud brick walls. They eat slowly, sharing what they have. The conversation is quiet, mostly about the fields, the weather, the river. Outside, the village grows peaceful. A donkey brays somewhere in the distance, the sound of insects fills the warm evening air, and countless stars begin to appear across the dark Egyptian sky. As one historian beautifully put it, it was the beauty of survival repeated so many times that it became culture. Ancient Egypt didn't last for millennia just because every single day was extraordinary. No, it lasted because millions of ordinary days held together. The repetitive, grueling, yet quiet daily acts of sharing bread, surviving the elements, and pushing through another day, these were the true heartbeat of the civilization. For these ordinary families, happiness didn't come from great wealth, fine linen, or gold. It came from a successful harvest, a full basket of grain, fresh bread shared with loved ones, and another peaceful day safely completed beside the life-giving Nile. Before sunrise tomorrow, that same quiet rhythm will begin all over again. So I'll leave you with this question to ponder. If happiness doesn't come from wealth or luxury, what truly constitutes a wealthy life? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope you never look at ancient Egypt quite the same way again. Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome back to the explainer. Today, we're zooming in on one of the most monumental achievements in human history, to uncover what life was really like in ancient Egypt. We're going to examine the genuinely grueling reality behind the Great Pyramids, and we're going to separate the Hollywood myths from the hard archaeological facts. Picture this. As another morning begins over the Nile Valley, the very first rays of sunlight are just starting to touch these massive, pale limestone blocks rising up from the desert. In the distance, this unbelievable construction project is taking shape. I mean, one day the whole world is going to know these as the Great Pyramids. But for the workers standing out there beneath the morning sky, this is just another day of incredibly hard, back-breaking labor. The work has to start early, way before that desert heat becomes totally overwhelming. And remember, there are no cranes out here, no engines, literally no modern machines whatsoever. It is just raw human strength, careful planning, and a whole lot of teamwork. So that brings up a really massive question. Who actually built these things? For a long time, if you asked practically anyone who was out there pulling those huge stones across the sand, the answer was almost always exactly the same, right? Slaves. It's this incredibly powerful image, a captive people forced to labor in the scorching sun, totally at the mercy of a cruel pharaoh. But what if I told you that the evidence we have today actually forces us to completely rethink that entire picture? Were these workers really the enslaved masses that pop culture tells us they were? Yeah, for decades, Hollywood has sold us this myth of forced labor, starvation, and just absolute cruelty. But the archaeological reality, it's completely different. Modern excavations actually show that the Great Pyramid of Giza was built by tens of thousands of highly skilled workers. A lot of them are actually farmers. When the annual Nile flood came through and made working the fields impossible, they'd come work on the monuments. They were doing this for a salary or as a form of tax payment to the state, which is known as a corvée system, until their specific rotation was up and they could return to their families. The real game changer here came from archaeologists like Mark Lenner. When his team started excavating near Giza, they didn't find some temporary, miserable slave camp. No, they uncovered a massive, purpose-built workers' city. We are talking about a highly organized, booming settlement. They had long barracks, huge industrial bakeries, breweries, storage facilities, the whole shebang. This was a thriving hub built specifically to house and support this massive, rotating labor force. And okay, here is a statistic that absolutely shatters that whole starving worker myth: 300 grams. When they analyzed animal bones at this worker city, they found out these guys were eating remarkably well. Archaeologists estimate they were getting about 300 grams of prime beef every single day. To put that into perspective for you, that is basically the equivalent of eating a modern quarter pounder with cheese daily. But look, they needed literally every single calorie. Their daily meals were simple but super nourishing: fresh bread, onions, garlic, fish from the Nile, and plenty of beer. The physical toll of hauling stone in that intense heat meant they were burning off that rich diet in just hours of sheer, exhausting exertion. And when we say exertion, we mean it. The process of moving these stones was agonizingly slow. First, groups of men carve these giant limestone blocks using just simple copper chisels. Then, they have to heave them onto these heavy wooden sledges. To actually move them, workers are pulling together on thick ropes, while others are constantly pouring water onto the sand right in front of the sledge to lubricate it and help it slide. A single stone could take hours to move just a short distance. The dust rises gently into the air. The sound of stone striking stone echoes everywhere. But the pace is slow and steady. And the supervisors are constantly watching, because accuracy is everything here. Even the tiniest mistake could ruin the structure above. But despite how incredibly grueling this was, there's actually a really profound sense of camaraderie among the crews. Inside the Great Pyramid itself, archaeologists have found ancient graffiti left behind by the workers. They organized themselves into these units with amazing names, like the Friends of Khufu Gang or the Drunkards of Menkauri. I love that. It brilliantly shows that this wasn't some beaten-down, miserable workforce. Mark Lenner actually compares the whole vibe to an Amish barn raising. It was this massive, obligatory community event, but it was really driven by a shared sense of duty, national pride, and some serious team spirit. And that team spirit, it fed into a logistical machine that is just staggering to think about. Honestly, the ancient Egyptian hierarchy maps almost perfectly onto modern corporate project management. You've got the pharaoh sitting at the top as the executive sponsor, setting the grand vision. The vizier is basically your senior user, making sure the kingdom's interests are met. The lead architect, like Imhotep from the earlier pyramids, he's your project manager running the day-to-day. And then you've got your team leaders down on the ground, managing the specific gangs of craftsmen. It was just brilliant organization. Now, because this work was so dangerous and literally body-breaking, the state actually had to take really good care of its workforce. When archaeologists look at the skeletons of these workers, yeah, they see evidence of severe physical trauma. But they also see evidence of incredibly advanced medical care. We're talking successfully treated broken bones, and even signs of successful brain surgery. The state provided official designated physicians for the crews, and they even rationed out medicinal ingredients to keep everyone in working order. And this next part just blows my mind. It shows exactly how valued these skilled workers were. Ancient texts discovered at a village called Deir el-Medina reveal that even though almost a third of worker absences were due to sickness or injuries from this brutal labor, their monthly grain rations never dropped. Yes, you heard that right. The ancient Egyptians literally had a system of state-sponsored healthcare and paid sick days. They knew they had to keep their tomb builders healthy if they wanted the project to succeed. So if we zoom out from the individual workers for a second, you realize the pyramids weren't just popping up in some isolated empty desert. They were actually the center of a massive supply chain, anchored by what we call Hayt el Garab, or the lost port city of the pyramids. To pull this off, the Egyptians actually dug deep into the floodplain to create a gigantic man-made harbor right there at the Giza Plateau. This allowed boats to sail in and deliver crazy amounts of materials directly to the construction zones. And we literally have the receipts for this. Back in 2013, archaeologists made an unbelievable discovery, the Diary of Murer. These are 4,500-year-old papyrus logbooks. Actually, they're the oldest papyrus texts we have ever found. They were written by an official named Murer, who was managing a crew of about 200 men. His diary gives us the day-by-day logistics of loading boats with premium limestone from the Tour quarries, and then navigating them across the Nile and through these canal networks right up to Giza. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that it wasn't just stone flowing into that port. Archaeologists found shards of what's called combed ware pottery right in the workers' settlement. This type of pottery, it wasn't made in Egypt. It was basically the commercial shipping container of the ancient Levant, way over by the Eastern Mediterranean. Finding this proves that the port was taking in high-status imported goods, like olive oil and massive timber, from hundreds of miles away, probably to reward the top-tier workers and keep the whole expedition running smoothly. So you've got this vast global supply chain, but at the end of the day, it all comes back down to the grueling reality for the individual worker on the ground. As the afternoon slowly fades into evening, the harsh light softens. Long shadows start stretching across the desert floor. The workers carefully pack up their tools. They might have only moved a few stones today. In fact, some of these guys spend years sweating in the dust just to finish one tiny section, fully knowing they might never even see the completed monument. But they keep going, because they know that thousands of these grueling days, placing over 2 million blocks, will eventually create something that completely defies time itself. Which brings us to the core takeaway of this whole explainer. We've spent so much time asking how the Egyptians built the pyramids, but archaeologists like Mark Lenner suggest we should really be asking how the pyramids built Egypt. This wasn't just some pharaoh's vanity project. It was a massive organizational engine. Building these structures forced the creation of national infrastructure, complex supply chains, agricultural surpluses, and a truly unified labor force. The very act of building the pyramids is what united an entire civilization. Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought to end on. As the sun sets and the pyramid glows with that warm golden light, you really get a sense of the ancient human drive for monumental achievement. It's a drive that brought people together to push the absolute limits of what was possible, despite how difficult the life and the labor was. So, looking around at our world today, with all our massive engineering feats, space stations, and digital networks, what modern megaprojects do you think will define our civilization when archaeologists are digging us up 4,500 years from now? Thanks for exploring this with me today, and I'll catch you on the next Explain.
All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're completely dismantling those stubborn pop culture myths surrounding the construction of the Great Pyramids, and we're going to reveal the astonishing, evidence-based reality. You know, for way too long, the story of these ancient marvels has been hijacked by Hollywood tropes and, quite frankly, baseless theories. So we're going to look strictly at the archaeological and historical record to understand exactly how one of the most incredible engineering feats in human history was actually pulled off.
It's the ultimate question, isn't it? Who really built the pyramids? For decades, we've had this image drilled into our heads of miserable slaves toiling away in the harsh desert heat, forced to drag these massive stones under the crack of a whip. But as we dig into the actual archaeological evidence, the truth turns out to be far more fascinating, and honestly, a whole lot more inspiring. The reality shows us that the builders were actually highly prized, state-sponsored seasonal laborers. Now, to really understand this, we need to think about what their normal lives were like. Life in ancient Egypt was incredibly difficult. Try to picture a peaceful evening in a typical farming village. There are no electric lights, no modern furniture. Families would sit on woven reed mats in their mud brick houses where literally every object was made by hand. After a long day of grueling agricultural work, they'd gather around small cooking fires, sharing stories about wise kings, the mighty Nile, and the gods who kept the balance of order. Every single day brought hard work, and every season brought uncertainty. But there was also a deep comfort in that routine, following the timeless rhythm of the Nile. When the annual Nile flood submerged their farmlands for months at a time, everything paused. But instead of sitting idle while the fields were underwater, these farmers were recruited, housed, and paid by the state to work on the pyramids.
Now, to house this massive influx of seasonal workers, the state had to get incredibly organized. Archaeologists have uncovered a massive, elegantly laid out settlement known as the Hayt el Garab site, sometimes called the Lost City of the Pyramids. It comes complete with these ancient barracks and a huge gallery complex. This was definitely not some chaotic squatter camp. It was a highly structured facility housing rotating, modular teams of skilled workers. It's actually a lot like a highly efficient, precocious military base.
I love this quote because it brilliantly captures how we should view their labor. Archaeologist Mark Lenner explains it perfectly. Obligatory labor ranges from slavery all the way to the Amish, where a barn raising is a religious event. This is a hell of a barn. See, the ancient Egyptians operated under a feudal system of obligatory labor known as bok. Everyone, from the poorest farmer up to the highest officials, owed bok to those above them. Building the Great Pyramid was a massive, nation-building community effort, a deeply ingrained social obligation, not some cruel system of disposable slavery.
Section 1. The Lost Port City.
We really need to completely rethink the landscape of ancient Giza. It wasn't just a giant, barren sandbox. It was a major, bustling Mediterranean port city. Excavations and drill cores have revealed man-made harbors, deep delivery basins, and offloading quays right at the base of the plateau. It was a thriving logistical hub where ships could sail in and deliver vast quantities of materials directly to the construction zone.
And the supply chains feeding this port? Absolutely staggering. These workers were supplied via massive maritime trade networks. Archaeologists have actually found fragments of Levantine-combed ware right at the workers' site. These specific jars were designed to survive the rough conditions of sea transport. This tells us these workers were receiving precious imported goods, likely things like olive oil or wine, brought in from hundreds of kilometers away along what was known as the Byblos Run.
Section 2. Healthcare and prime beef.
Okay, get this. The benefits package was astonishingly good for the ancient world. Texts from workers' villages, along with skeletal remains, reveal an incredible system of state-sponsored healthcare for these craftsmen. We have actual written records showing workers received paid sick days and that the state actively rationed out medicinal ingredients to the workforce. Skeletons show perfectly set, successfully treated broken bones and, remarkably, even evidence of successful brain surgery. The state clearly recognized that these experienced workers were valuable assets, and keeping them healthy was absolutely critical to the project's success.
But it wasn't just healthcare. When it came to their diet, the state spared absolutely no expense. Workers received an estimated 300 grams of premium meat every single day.
To put that into perspective, faunal expert Richard Redding pointed out they were getting almost 300 grams a day of meat, which is about a Big Mac or a quarter pounder with cheese. Honestly, experts were astounded by the sheer volume of cattle, sheep, and goat bones found at the site. It was enough to feed thousands of people meat daily. Remember that simple village life we talked about earlier, where the diet was mostly bread and onions? This was a massive upgrade. These laborers were feasting on the absolute best prime beef available, shipped in from vast estates down the Nile.
Section 3. Master Problem Solvers.
So, the state successfully mobilized and fed this huge, healthy workforce. But how on earth did they overcome the mind-boggling engineering challenges? They didn't have heavy machinery, and no, they definitely didn't have extraterrestrial help. They were just master problem solvers who used simple but brilliant physics. To drag massive stones across the desert, physicists recently proved that pouring a specific amount of water on the sand right in front of the transport sled drastically reduces friction and stops the sand from piling up. To level the massive foundation, they likely just used water-filled trenches that function perfectly as giant spirit levels. And to align the pyramid to true north with mind-blowing accuracy, literally within 1/10 of a degree, they just tracked the shadows of a stick planted in the ground during the equinox. Simple tools applied with absolute genius.
Section 4. The Diary of Merer.
Which brings us to our most concrete piece of evidence, the oldest papyrus texts ever discovered, found buried in man-made caves on the Red Sea coast. This is the Diary of Merer, an inspector who lived during the 27th year of King Khufu's reign. His journal tracks the precise day-by-day logistics of his 40-man crew. We can literally read how on day 25, they loaded massive white limestone blocks at the Tura quarries. By day 27, they had sailed down the Nile to the pyramid site and unloaded their cargo at the water basins. And by day 28, they cast off to do the whole shebang all over again. It is a breathtakingly detailed project management log.
Furthermore, this papyrus proves they utilized a highly sophisticated 30-day civil calendar. They weren't just looking up at the moon and guessing. They had a meticulously structured system to track project management, labor rotation, and daily delivery schedules for hundreds of blocks every single month.
This leads us to a pretty profound realization. Through Mayor's diary, we don't just see the logistics, we get a glimpse into the ancient mindset. What did this monumental project actually mean to the everyday people hauling these stones?
The papyri referred to the Great Pyramid by its ancient name, Akhet Khufu, which translates to the horizon of Khufu. Knowing they viewed it as a horizon, a celestial meeting point, rather than just a dead king's tomb, well, that fundamentally changes our perspective. The pyramid's inner passages were perfectly angled at the imperishable ones, those circumpolar stars that never set, designed to guide the pharaoh to the eternal sky. We have to ask, was this incredible feat of engineering not just a monument, but a deliberate, mathematically perfect gateway between the hard earth they worked and the eternal sky they worshipped? And if human beings could achieve all of this through sheer ingenuity and community effort thousands of years ago, what limits do we truly have today?
Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping straight into a story that is going to completely shatter the Hollywood myth of the Great Pyramid builders. So think about what you picture when someone mentions the construction of the pyramids. You're probably imagining thousands of oppressed slaves, right? Toiling away under a brutal, blistering sun in some barren, dusty desert, whipped by harsh overseers while dragging impossibly heavy stones. It makes for a great movie scene for sure. But what if I told you that almost everything we've been taught about the pyramid builders is, well, completely wrong? Modern archaeology is painting a radically different picture.
Okay, let's dive into this. We really need to contrast that classic, gloomy fiction, the starvation, the isolation, the whips, with the actual, stunning archaeological reality. The folks who built these monuments weren't an isolated, disposable slave force. They were a highly organized, deeply valued, and frankly, privileged workforce. And they weren't stuck in the desolate wasteland either. They were actually living and working in a vibrant, bustling port city. Yeah, you heard that right, a port city.
Recent satellite imaging and 3D reconstructions have completely blown the lid off this topic. They've revealed something called the Aharamat branch, an entirely extinct branch of the Nile River. This wasn't just a tiny stream, we're talking about a massive waterway, 64 kilometers long, half a kilometer wide, and deep enough to handle major shipping. It flowed right up to the Giza Plateau. The builders literally engineered floodgates, basins, and canals to float construction materials directly to the foot of the pyramids. It's like a giant puzzle, and suddenly the pieces are fitting together.
Now you might be wondering, how do we actually know all these hyper-specific details? Well, we literally have their own receipts. Back in 2013, archaeologists stumbled upon the Red Sea Scrolls, which included the actual daily diary of a guy named Inspector Mirror. Mir was basically an ancient middle manager in charge of a crew of about 40 boatmen. His journal is impeccable. It reveals a logistics operation that could honestly rival modern shipping companies. Every 10 days, his team sailed down the river, picked up this brilliant white Tura limestone, and hauled it back. They were moving roughly 200 blocks a month just to clad the outside of the Great Pyramid. They even tracked their shifts in half-day increments. It is just a masterclass in project management.
Even with those canals, though, they still had to drag stones weighing literally tons across the remaining sand without any modern machinery. No cranes, no trucks. So how did they do it? They used a brilliant, yet incredibly simple physics trick. And we know this because of a tomb painting from around 1880 BC. They'd place these massive stones on wooden sleds. Then, a worker standing at the very front of the sled would just pour a calculated trickle of water onto the sand right in front of them. It sounds too simple to work, right? But physicists recently confirmed that wetting the sand prevents it from bunching up and drastically reduces friction. It essentially cuts the pulling force required right in half. Talk about working smarter, not harder.
So, getting back to the workers themselves. This completely shatters the idea of a starved, enslaved workforce. These laborers were doing incredibly intense, calorie-burning physical work, and the state made absolutely sure they were fueled up. Archaeologist Richard Reading studied the massive amounts of animal bones found at the workers' settlements. He estimated they were getting almost 300 grams a day of meat. He actually compared it to getting a Big Mac or a quarter pounder with cheese every single day.
Let's just pause and think about that number for a second. 300 grams of meat daily. In the ancient world, eating prime beef, sheep, and goat every day wasn't just a good meal, it was an immense, unheard of luxury. The state wasn't tossing them scraps, they were feeding them the absolute best cuts available, washing it down with bread and mild beer, ensuring their workforce stayed strong. Frankly, slaves were simply not treated or fed with that level of premium investment.
And the perks didn't stop at the dinner table. These workers enjoyed a whole suite of benefits. Along with the prime beef and emmer wheat baked in massive state-run bakeries, they basically had state-sponsored health care. We found worker skeletons showing broken bones that were expertly set and healed, and, get this, even evidence of successful brain surgery. We also have written records showing they got paid sick days. As for housing, they weren't sleeping in the dirt. Archaeologists have dug up sleek, purpose-built dormitories designed to comfortably house a rotating labor force of thousands. These people were prized assets, and the state went out of its way to protect its investment.
Which brings up a really obvious question. If they weren't slaves, why on earth were they doing all this backbreaking work? Archaeologist Mark Leonard explains this through an ancient Egyptian concept called bak. Bak is essentially a kind of feudal obligation or duty that you owe to the people above you in the social hierarchy. It wasn't slavery, it was more like a massive mandatory community project. Leonard actually compares it to an Amish barn raising, where the whole community comes together out of obligation and shared purpose for a massive event. Except, as Leonard jokes, this is a hell of a barn.
Now, building this hell of a barn was deeply tied into everyday commerce. Giza wasn't just a dusty construction site, it was a vibrant epicenter of trade. And remember, unlike modern markets, they didn't have paper coins or printed banknotes. Everyday trade was based entirely on barter. A basket of grain might be traded for fresh vegetables, or a clay pot exchanged for a woven basket. It was a colorful, peaceful market system built heavily on trust and fairness. And this network of trust extended globally. Take the Byblos Run, for example, a major maritime route connecting Egypt to the Levant. We've actually found Levantine combed ware pottery right at Giza, which were essentially the ancient shipping containers used for long sea journeys.
The Great Pyramid is truly the product of a massive global supply chain. As the sun rose over the Nile, these bustling markets at Giza would fill with traders from all over the known world. You'd hear quiet conversations, the soft footsteps of donkeys, and see skilled craftsmen displaying their goods. They brought towering cedars from Lebanon for scaffolding and precious olive oil and resin. Workers used advanced tools made from arsenical copper, a super durable, intentionally produced alloy. You'd even see caravans that had crossed vast deserts carrying gold from Nubia and incense from the land of Punt. And amidst all this, children would walk beside their parents, observing the negotiations and learning the value of patience and honesty. By midday, traders would rest under cloth shelters, drinking mild beer and waiting out the heat. It was an incredible cosmopolitan hub where commerce, diplomacy, and the quiet, steady rhythm of the Nile all fueled this monumental shared effort.
So this brings us to a final thought. The evidence is absolutely clear. The Great Pyramids were not born from whips and chains. They were the ultimate triumph of logistics, international commerce, community duty, and a workforce that was genuinely cared for. So I want to leave you with this question. If we stop looking at these ancient monuments as products of oppression and misery, and instead see them as miracles of cooperation, project management, and human ingenuity, how does that change our entire view of human history? Think about that the next time you see a picture of the pyramids. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning everything you think you know.
Welcome to This Explainer. As the busy market slowly fades into the distance, let's leave the crowded paths and quietly step inside the home of an ordinary Egyptian family. If you've ever wondered why life was so exceptionally difficult for the average person in the ancient world, well, you're in exactly the right place. We are going to uncover the grueling reality that defined their everyday existence. Okay, let's dive into this. When we think of ancient Egypt, it's so easy for our minds to naturally drift to golden pharaohs, towering stone pyramids, and elite priests. But what was life actually like for the 99% of ancient Egyptians who didn't live in palaces? I want you to forget the pharaohs for a moment. We really need to focus on the everyday survival of the common people, because understanding their daily struggle is absolutely key to truly grasping the resilience and ingenuity of this incredible civilization. Section 1, Built from Mud and Sun. Let's begin our virtual tour by starting on the outside. Imagine standing there, baking in the scorching daytime heat, looking at the layout of these small, self-contained villages where most ordinary people lived. What you're seeing here are the ruins of a workman's village. Notice how tightly knit these communities were. They were dusty, compact, and completely exposed to the harsh elements. These weren't spacious, breezy estates. They were highly practical, modest spaces built out of pure necessity, where neighbors lived shoulder to shoulder, sharing the heavy burden of the intense climate. To really understand the extreme social hierarchy of the time, we just need to contrast the housing materials. The wealthy elite lived in sprawling estates made of durable limestone, ornate wood, and painted decorations. Meanwhile, commoners relied entirely on homes built from sun-dried mud brick and reeds. They harvested mud from the fertile Nile River floodplains, mixed it with straw and water for strength, and baked it in the sun. But the catch is these mud brick homes were transient. They were highly susceptible to severe erosion from rare heavy rains and the annual Nile floods. This meant ordinary families faced a constant, exhausting chore of maintaining and rebuilding their walls just to keep a roof over their heads. However, those mud brick houses weren't just stylistic choices. They were a brilliant survival mechanism. To combat the relentless desert heat and blinding glare, builders used incredibly thick mud brick walls for insulation. And this wasn't to keep warmth inside, but to keep the intense daytime heat outside. It made the interior remarkably cool during the scorching days and warm during the chilly desert nights. They also placed small windows very high up on the walls to allow hot air to escape while keeping the harsh sunlight and blowing dust out. Add in flat roofs supported by wooden beams covered with reeds and mud, and you have ingenious climate control born out of absolute necessity.
Section 2. Inside the desert home.
Now imagine stepping through that narrow wooden doorway, leaving the blazing sun behind, and entering a dimly lit, surprisingly cool interior. Inside, you'd find a truly minimalist life. There is no clutter here. The rooms are small, and the floors are made of smooth, compacted earth that the family had to carefully sweep every single morning. They'd sit and sleep on simple woven reed mats. Any clothing or valuable belongings were kept in a wooden chest. And most importantly, large clay jars stood neatly against the walls, holding precious commodities like raw grain, cooking oil, dried beans, and vital drinking water. Every single item in the home was made with care and stored with absolute precision. Nothing was unnecessary, and honestly, there was zero room for waste. Just to give you a stark idea of the lack of modern comforts, think about how we end a hard day today, sinking into a soft feather pillow. But the ancient Egyptian reality involved sleeping on a bed of woven cords and resting their heads on crescent-shaped wooden headrests. Soft comfort as we know it was a luxury practically unknown to the common people. Their homes and furnishings were designed strictly for function and surviving the brutal conditions of their world. Let's move on and see how this builds in Section 3, the brutal daily grind. As we transition out of the inner living quarters and into the courtyard, we find the beating heart of the household, which was also the site of the most punishing physical labor. Now, what's really interesting about this limestone mortar is its specific design. Its deep, steep-sided curvature wasn't an accident. It was meticulously designed so that a person could relentlessly pound hard, raw grain with a heavy wooden pestle without the precious kernels flying out onto the dirt. This was just the first grueling step in making the family's daily bread. After that initial exhausting pounding to break the grains open, the material was moved to a saddle cornstone. Notice its slightly bowed shape and rough pitted surface. The fragmented grain would be placed on this stone, and the baker would use another heavy handstone to painstakingly pulverize it by hand, rubbing it back and forth to create flour. Just imagine the physical toll of this process. Experimental archaeology has shown exactly what this required. Imagine spending hours on your knees in the dusty courtyard, your body lodged firmly against the base stone, using all your upper body strength to push a heavy stone back and forth. This back-breaking work happened hour after hour, every single day, just to grind enough fine flour to make a single loaf of fresh bread in the clay oven. It's a stark reminder of why daily life was so intensely difficult and exhausting, even if the air finally carried the comforting smell of warm, baked grain by the end of it. Section 4. Family, faith, and survival. But the home was more than just a place of endless physical labor. There was a severe psychological toll to this environment. 30%. Let's pause for a somber moment on that number. That was the devastating infant mortality rate in ancient Egypt. Imagine the constant, heavy anxiety that families faced every single day. Survival was never guaranteed, and the terror of losing a child or a mother during childbirth was a looming shadow over every single home. So the crucial point is that because of this intense vulnerability, the home became a place of fierce spiritual defense. Families obsessively directed their prayers to specific household gods, like Bes and Taweret. These deities weren't distant figures worshipped only in massive state-run temples. They were venerated right there at domestic shrines in the home. They were the fierce protectors of fertility and childbirth, prayed to daily in a desperate attempt to stave off that high mortality rate and keep the family safe from harm. Because survival was so incredibly difficult, it required a complete team effort. The family unit was an inseparable workforce. Women spent their days at the heavy grinding stones preparing food and weaving linen. Men worked outside the home, farming or fishing, but also maintained those degrading mud brick structures or crafted essential tools. Even children had crucial roles, like gathering firewood or carrying heavy jars of water from the Nile. There were no formal classrooms for these kids. Life itself was their teacher. Mothers taught daughters how to bake and weave, while fathers taught sons how to build or farm. The essential knowledge of survival was passed quietly and deliberately from parent to child through shared labor.
Section 5. The Rooftop Escape.
Finally, after a long, exhausting day, the sun begins to set. As family members return home and wash the dust of the day from their feet, there is a profound sensory shift. An oil lamp is carefully lit, its small flame dancing quietly and casting a soft golden glow against the mud brick walls. But many families chose to climb the stairs to the flat roof. In a house that baked in the sun all day, the flat roof transformed into a cool, peaceful sanctuary. Up there, under the stars, they could finally enjoy the cool evening breeze and gentle conversation about the river, the harvest, and their neighbors, finding precious comfort in these simple routines. Just picture it, as described so beautifully in our sources, without noise, without hurry, without electric lights, only silence, the peaceful flow of the river, and another quiet night in ancient Egypt. I want you to let that peacefulness wash over you for a moment. After a grueling day of sheer survival, as the sounds of the village slowly softened below, this quiet communion on the rooftop under the vast ancient night sky was their ultimate reward and comfort. It really makes you reflect on the incredible resilience and ingenuity of everyday ancient Egyptians. Could you endure the brutal physical labor of the ancient daytime, the back-breaking grinding, the intense heat, and the constant struggle for survival, just to experience the absolute starry silence of an Egyptian night? Thank you for exploring this fascinating reality with me today in this explainer, and I hope it gave you a profound new appreciation for the lives of those who built this ancient world. Welcome to the explainer. Let's just jump right in. The first light of dawn gently touches the surface of the Nile River once again. A thin layer of mist rises from the cool water, drifting quietly above the current before disappearing into the warmy morning air. For the people of ancient Egypt, this river is way more than just water. It's a road, a source of food, a guide through the land. It's the quiet heartbeat of an entire civilization. Long before roads connected towns and villages, small wooden boats carried people and goods from one place to another, their sails catching the gentle northern wind while the current slowly carried them south and north along the river's winding path. Standing on the riverbank, you can almost watch the fishermen preparing their nets in that early light. Their movements are so calm and practiced. A father quietly shows his young son how to untangle a net, simple skills that will one day become his own. Nearby, another boat is being loaded with sacks of grain, clay jars of cooking oil, and woven baskets of onions and dried dates. Nothing is rushed. Every item is balanced with care. The tall, green papyrus plants swaying gently in the breeze will later become one of Egypt's greatest inventions, used to record their entire history. As the afternoon sun lowers, the golden light reflects across the water like polished glass, and life here seems to move at the speed of nature. Calm, steady, unchanging. But here is where we really need to shatter that peaceful illusion. What did it actually take to survive on this river? We tend to look at ancient Egypt through this highly romanticized lens of golden sunsets and gentle breezes. But the truth? It's entirely different. Keeping this civilization afloat required a grueling, back-breaking reality that most of us today couldn't even begin to imagine. It was a world defined by intense physical struggle, constant danger, and just immense human endurance. The geography they were up against was incredibly daunting. The Nile functioned as the empire's main artery, sure, but it was snaking through thousands of miles of deadly, unforgiving desert. The Egyptians actually believed the earth looked like a flat pancake, with the Nile flowing right through the dead center of it. And during the annual summer inundation, when the river flooded the valley, navigation became insanely hazardous. The floodwaters would rise so high that towns were basically turned into isolated islands scattered throughout the valley.
They did have one major advantage, though. It was basically a geographic cheat code. The Nile River naturally flows from south to north, but the prevailing winds in the region blow from north to south. So if you wanted to travel downstream, you simply let the current carry your boat northward. And if you wanted to return upstream, you just unfurled your sail and let the wind push you south. It was brilliantly efficient. But this predictability was kind of a double-edged sword. Because river travel was naturally so easy, the ancient Egyptians didn't really have an early need to innovate in complex sailing techniques compared to other ancient seafaring cultures.
The absolute crucial point here is that their entire existence was completely dependent on this uncontrollable natural cycle. There were 3 rigid seasons dictated by the river. First was Akhet, the flooding season when the river covered the land and left behind a rich layer of black silt. Next was Peret, the planting season, where seeds were sown straight into that thick mud. And finally, Shemu, the harvest season. There was zero margin for error. If the flood was too high, villages literally washed away. If it was too low, catastrophic drought and famine. This intense physical struggle bled right into their daily agricultural lives. Farming those muddy banks was pure, agonizing work. Farmers had to dig irrigation channels and walls by hand just to divert and contain the floodwaters. They relied on a simple crane-like machine called a shaduf to painstakingly lift heavy amounts of water from the river up to their fields. The sun was absolutely relentless. The labor was manual, and survival was never, ever guaranteed. And the struggle extended directly to how they traveled. Long before those grand wooden ships of the pharaohs, locals braved the river in fragile boats made out of giant papyrus reeds. These plants grew up to 5 meters high. They would dry them out and bind them tightly together into bundles to form the shape of a boat. While they were light and great for fishing, relying on bundles of reeds to navigate a massive, unpredictable river, that is seriously perilous work. But as the society grew in complexity, so did their transport. By the Old Kingdom, they had evolved into building massive wooden traveling ships. Because local Egyptian wood was pretty scarce and of terrible quality, they actually imported huge amounts of cedar wood from places like Lebanon. These advanced vessels could be up to 30 meters long, and they allowed the rising elites to really project their power, expand their political influence, and launch major commercial and military expeditions. Yet, for the common boatmen powering these ships, the reality was terrifying. Just listen to this ancient account from the Chester Beatty Papyrus. As for the sailor, it is said that crocodiles have taken up their positions to spy on him. The sailor is exhausted while the oar is in his hand and the lash on his back. It perfectly captures the sheer nightmare of it all. Exhausting rowing against strong currents, the constant threat of deadly wildlife lurking in the water, and brutal physical punishment from overseers. And if you think river travel sounds tough, maritime travel was even worse. Another ancient text, the Papyrus Lansing, describes the grim reality for specialized mariners who took these ships out onto the Mediterranean or the Red Sea. It notes that as they depart for foreign lands like Syria, not one of them says, "We shall see Egypt again." These voyages pulled men away from their families for long periods and threw them into incredibly dangerous coastal conditions where death was a very real, very common outcome. Now, despite these overwhelming human challenges, what they accomplished is just staggering. Think about this number, 7,300 tons. That is the estimated combined weight that the Egyptians moved by water during the reign of Queen Hatshepsut, when they transported 2 colossal stone obelisks at the exact same time. The scale of the monuments they moved on this river completely defies belief. To move that kind of weight, they had to build vessels of colossal proportions. We're talking about massive wooden barges nearly 100 meters long. That is roughly the length of a modern American football field. These incredible engineering feats were constructed specifically to haul massive granite blocks and obelisks from the stone quarries way down at Aswan, all the way north to temple complexes like Karnak. But remember, engines didn't exist, so how did they move a 100-meter barge loaded with thousands of tons of stone? Human muscle. The logistics of moving these mountains of stone were agonizing. It required thousands of rowers fighting against the river's currents. Navigators had to constantly watch for treacherous, shifting sandbanks hidden under the water. And here's the absolute most brutal part. When the winds died down, teams of men actually had to get off the boat, stand on the muddy riverbanks, and manually tow these colossal ships forward using nothing but long ropes and their own raw strength. Which brings us to what happened when the water ended. The Nile handled all the long-distance bulk transport, but to actually reach the quarries, the mines, or the Red Sea, the Egyptians had to brave utterly unforgiving land routes. These were quite literally roads built on sand, stone, and a whole lot of sweat. The agony of this land transport is hard to even wrap your head around. The primary workhorses of the desert were donkeys. Caravans would spend weeks walking alongside these animals, carrying heavy grain, copper, and incense through brutal desert treks, like the famous route through the Wadi Hammamat to the Red Sea. And for monument construction, workers dragged multi-ton stone blocks across the blazing desert on wooden sledges. To manage the immense friction, workers had to walk ahead of the sledge, continuously pouring water onto the sand just to lubricate the path. Every single inch was a battle against the earth. So the fascinating point here is that this constant, immense physical struggle against the river and the desert didn't just build their physical world. It profoundly shaped their minds, their moral codes, and their spiritual beliefs. To the ancient Egyptians, the line between practical transport and sacred transport basically didn't exist. Literal boats transformed into spiritual vessels. The divine bark, or boat, of the god Amun would physically be carried on the shoulders of priests. They believed that when you died, the journey to the afterlife involved crossing what they called the winding waterway by boat, just so you could safely reach the field of reeds, the Egyptian version of heaven. Good nautical ability wasn't just a resume skill, it was equated with order, stability, and spiritual righteousness. In fact, nautical labor was so deeply embedded in their psyche that even their highest deities weren't spared from doing the heavy lifting. They believed that the sun god, Ra, had to navigate his own solar bark across the dangerous sky every single day, relying on a crew of powerful gods to row him safely and fend off cosmic chaos and giant serpents. Think about that. If the gods themselves had to row just to keep the universe from falling apart, you can imagine how the average Egyptian viewed their own daily labor on the river.
Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. Look at the pyramids, the temples, the golden artifacts. Was their mastery of the river really just a gift of nature, as historians often say? Or was it a testament to staggering, uncompromising human endurance? The romantic myth of ancient Egypt is beautiful, but the reality, a civilization built on calloused hands, aching backs, and sheer willpower against an unforgiving landscape, is, I think, infinitely more fascinating. What do you take away from this? Next time you see a picture of the quiet Nile, remember the millions of people who gave their sweat and their lives to conquer it. Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. I'm so glad you're joining me today because we are going to dive into a really fascinating contrast. You know, when we look back at ancient Egypt, we almost always focus on the grand monuments, but we rarely stop to ask, how on earth did ordinary people survive a life that was, frankly, incredibly difficult? Well, today we are going to look at how the towering stone temples of ancient Egypt, which were literally believed to be the earthly homes of the gods, provided a critical, absolute anchor for everyday folks. Okay, I want you to picture this with me for a second. As another peaceful morning kicks off beside the Nile, the very first golden rays of sunlight slowly start illuminating the towering stone temples standing high above the surrounding villages. You can almost feel the chill of the desert night finally giving way to the warmth of the sun. It's beautiful, it's serene, and honestly, it's deeply profound, because this wasn't just a pretty sunrise. For the ancient Egyptians, this daily event was a massive spiritual reassurance. Which brings us to Section 1, Dawn, the Divine Homes. So, to really understand how ordinary people coped with such a tough existence, we first have to understand their relationship with the divine right at the break of dawn. For the ancient Egyptians, everyday life and the natural order of the world were just completely intertwined with their faith. I mean, the rising of the sun, the yearly flooding of the Nile, the growing of crops, it was all part of this great, massive cosmic cycle. While the village is just starting to wake up, the priests are already quietly slipping into the temple through these massive stone gateways. The air inside, it's cool and perfectly still. You've got these tall, heavy columns stretching all the way to the ceiling, intricately carved with images of lotus flowers, papyrus plants, birds, and sacred symbols. And soft beams of sunlight are just starting to filter through narrow openings high above, filling the vast temple with this warm, golden glow. It's an incredibly atmospheric, deeply sacred space. Now notice the stark contrast here. Inside the temple, you have these highly restricted, sacred inner chambers filled with priests performing very precise, quiet rituals. But outside, you have ordinary villagers already starting their back-breaking daily work. And most of these villagers will never, ever be allowed to step foot into those sacred inner rooms. Yet they fully, completely trust that the ceremonies happening inside are actively keeping their world from falling apart. Let's move on to Section 2, the Keepers of Harmony. That brings us to the individuals actually working inside those walls, the priests. They arrived at dawn to perform duties that were so much more than just religious chores. They were a matter of national survival.
The absolutely crucial point here is this concept of natural harmony. The primary purpose of all temple activities, every single prayer, every offering, was to maintain this delicate balance that sustains all life. If this harmony was broken, the Egyptians believed the natural order itself would just completely collapse. To preserve this order, the priests followed meticulous morning rituals, first washing carefully to symbolize their spiritual readiness before even thinking about entering the inner chambers. Then they'd light small lamps and burn fragrance incense, letting the smoke slowly rise into the quiet air. Finally, they performed simple, beautiful acts of respect and gratitude, placing offerings of fresh bread, fruit, flowers, and clean water directly in front of the beautifully carved statues of the gods. You know, the weight of these unseen ceremonies really can't be overstated. Outside those thick walls, ordinary villagers remained completely separated from these sacred spaces. Like we said, most would live their entire lives without ever catching a glimpse of the inner rooms. But that separation didn't weaken their faith. Actually, it strengthened their reliance on it. They held complete, unwavering trust in the priests, believing wholeheartedly that these quiet, hidden rituals were actively keeping harmony alive throughout the entire land. Next up, Section 3. Gods watching over all. So who exactly were they serving in there? Let's take a look at a few of the primary deities believed to watch over the kingdom. We have Ra, the sun god, whose light literally brings each new day. There's Osiris, who's deeply associated with renewal and the afterlife. Isis, known for her profound wisdom and protection. And of course, Horus, often represented as a fierce falcon, just keeping a watchful eye over the entire kingdom. But to the ordinary villagers, these definitely weren't just distant theological concepts. These stories were shared quietly from one generation to the very next. Parents would tell them to their kids during peaceful evenings. Grandparents passed down the tales they remembered hearing when they were young. The stories of these gods became seamlessly woven right into the everyday fabric of village life. Which leads us to Section 4, Comfort in the Chaos. And this brings us to the real core theme of our explainer today. How did this quiet, pervasive faith act as such a crucial anchor? Because let's face it, for the ordinary Egyptian, life was overwhelmingly difficult. Outside the heavy stone walls of the temple, the realities were harsh. They were constantly facing failing crops and massive agricultural uncertainty tied to the unpredictability of the Nile. Unexpected illnesses would visit families, tearing through communities. And of course, they faced the immense vulnerabilities of simply growing old in an ancient world without modern comforts. Life was incredibly fragile. But amidst all that chaos, the towering presence of the temples offered a real beacon in the darkness. When things got overwhelmingly difficult, they didn't just despair. They looked to the gods. The physical presence of those massive stone columns standing tall right above their villages served as a constant, reassuring reminder that they were not alone. When illness or severe hardship struck, they weren't just looking for physical survival. They leaned incredibly heavily on their beliefs. They trusted that their harsh, daily suffering was actually just one small part of a much larger, divine journey watched over by the gods. It was this grand perspective shift that helped them weather the intense storms of an unpredictable existence. Ultimately, this faith brought them immense comfort during the hardest times. This quiet belief system gave them the patience, the resilience, and the hope they needed to face a chaotic and deeply uncertain reality. It was the anchor that held them steady when everything else felt like it was falling apart. And finally, Section 5, the eternal star's dusk. So, let's move into the late afternoon and follow the sun's descent as the day starts to come to a close. Outside, the village settles back into a familiar, unhurried rhythm. The farmers, completely exhausted but finished for the day, return from the fields. Children are playing in the cooling shade beneath the palm trees. Out on the water, fishing boats just drift slowly toward the riverbank. Nothing feels rushed. Everything moves with a quiet, enduring purpose. Meanwhile, back at the temple, the afternoon sun fades and the sanctuary grows totally quiet once again. The final, softly spoken prayers of the day are uttered by the priests. The fragrant incense slowly dissipates into the warm evening air, and finally, the heavy wooden doors are gently pulled closed, ensuring the god can rest undisturbed for the night. The harmony of the land has been successfully maintained for one more day. As evening truly sets in, the temple stands peacefully beneath the deep blue sky, and the stars begin to appear above its ancient stone walls. The very same stars that countless generations of Egyptians looked up at are the same stars that shine down on us today. Which leaves us with a pretty powerful question to ponder. Do we, in our modern, super fast-paced lives, still seek that very same quiet comfort when faced with an uncertain world? Think about that as you go about your day. Thanks so much for joining me on This Explainer, and keep learning.
Welcome to This Explainer. We are jumping straight into something truly mind-bending today. When you look up at the stars at night or wake up to see the sunrise, you probably don't think much of it, right? It's just the quiet rhythm of nature. But for the people of ancient Egypt, the ordinary farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen, life was incredibly difficult. They survived at the absolute mercy of nature. A delayed flood or a harsh drought didn't just mean a bad harvest. It meant starvation and death. So for them, every single sunrise was not a given. It was a hard-won, high-stakes victory in a daily battle to keep the entire universe from collapsing into absolute chaos. Today, we're exploring the front lines of that cosmic war. To really wrap our heads around this worldview, we have to start with a concept called Ma'at. Now, Ma'at wasn't just some vague philosophical idea or a distant god. It was the literal principle of cosmic harmony and order. Think of it like the gravity that held their entire reality together. The Egyptians believed this delicate balance of life, the seasons, the flowing of the Nile, was under constant threat. Order didn't just maintain itself, it required constant, relentless protection, both from the gods up in the heavens and from mortal helpers right here on Earth. So, here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the battle for cosmic order. Then, the gods of kingship and creation. Third, the guardians of the sacred. Fourth, the priestly hierarchy. Fifth, wealth, politics, and power. And finally, the fall of the priests. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the battle for cosmic order, gods versus chaos. We really need to set the stage in the mythological realm where this eternal war was fought, day in and day out. The stakes here were absolute. On one side, you've got order, or Ma'at, bringing light, life, and the sunrise. It represents everything good and predictable in a world where everyday survival was tough. On the exact opposite side, you have chaos. And remember, the Egyptians didn't just see chaos as an abstract concept. For the villagers along the Nile, chaos meant disease, drought, and famine. It was a terrifying reality. And in their mythology, it was embodied by Apophis, this massive, terrifying underworld serpent whose only goal was to swallow the sun, and by Set, the volatile god of storms and destruction. The whole universe was framed as this literal, endless battleground between these two forces. Moving right along to Section 2, gods of kingship and creation, the divine protectors, Ra and Horus. Because let's face it, to fight against such massive forces of chaos, you need some absolute heavy hitters. And in the Egyptian pantheon, nobody hit heavier than Ra and Horus. There was this brilliant division of labor between these two incredible deities. Ra, the god of the sun, creation, and order, is the one literally traveling through the underworld every single night in a solar boat, physically battling that giant serpent Apophis just so the sun can rise for the farmers in the morning. Meanwhile, Horus, the god of the sky and kingship, operates in a completely different sphere. While Ra is busy in the underworld, Horus battles Set to avenge his murdered father, Osiris. And Horus was seen as the actual divine embodiment of the living pharaoh. But you know, this brings us to a massive question. If Ra and Horus are busy fighting these epic, universe-saving battles in the heavens and the underworld, who exactly is fighting for them on Earth? I mean, the gods needed backup, right? That brings us to Section 3, Guardians of the Sacred, Daily Rituals of the Temple. Enter the ancient Egyptian priests. These folks were the frontline soldiers stationed in the temples, tasked with keeping the gods energized and victorious. And the way they did this is fascinating. The priests treated what honestly looked like mundane morning chores as literal life-or-death missions. Step 1 was purification. They had to be spiritually ready before doing anything, which meant bathing in sacred pools, completely shaving their entire bodies, and wearing pure, clean linen. Step 2 was awakening. At dawn, high-ranking priests would enter the dark temple sanctuary to actually wake up the deity's spiritual essence, or Ka, using specific hymns and burning incense. And finally, Step 3, offerings. They presented massive feasts of bread, beer, and meat. The idea was that the god consumed the spiritual essence of the food. Then, in a very practical twist, the physical food was redistributed to feed the temple staff.
But it wasn't always hidden away in a dark sanctuary. These private temple rituals would regularly explode into massive public celebrations. During seasonal events, like the spectacular Opet festival at Karnak, priests would actually carry the statues of the gods out into the streets. They'd parade them through the massive crowds of ordinary people, which synchronized these divine blessings with the flooding of the Nile and the agricultural cycles. It was basically a spectacular way to show the public that cosmic harmony was being maintained and the crops were going to grow.
Let's look at Section 4, the priestly hierarchy, servants of the gods. Running temples of this scale required incredible organization and a deeply stratified bureaucracy. The priesthood was incredibly specialized. At the very top, you have the high priests, or first servants of the god. These guys were not just spiritual leaders, they were major political advisors. Next down are the lector priests. These were the scholars, the ones who recited complex, sacred texts and magical incantations. Then you have the sem priests. They were the undisputed experts in funerary rites and the gruesome, yet fascinating process of mummification. And finally, the wab priests, the pure ones, whose entire job was to maintain the absolute physical and spiritual cleanliness of the temple. Crucially, though, this hierarchy wasn't just a boys' club. Women held major positions, especially when serving female deities like Hathor or Isis. But the absolute pinnacle was a title called the God's Wife of Amun. By the time of the New Kingdom, the women holding this title possessed immense religious and political power. Historical figures like Nitocris and Hetpet weren't just in the background participating in rituals. They were controlling massive temple estates and directly influencing state affairs. So this presents another completely fascinating question. These priests started out as devoted servants, right? Bathing statues and baking bread for the gods. How exactly did serving the gods lead to them basically ruling over the mortals? We cover that in Section 5, Wealth, Politics, and Power of the Earthly Empire, because these temples weren't just places of worship. They were essentially the Wall Street and the Silicon Valley of ancient Egypt combined. These priests lived in a dual reality. Their spiritual duty was to keep the universe from ending by maintaining Ma'at and interpreting the will of the gods. But because they spoke for the gods, they wielded unbelievable earthly power. They were gifted massive agricultural estates, they controlled vast trade networks, and they commanded huge labor forces. By the time of the New Kingdom, temples like Karnak controlled so much wealth that they actually rivaled the royal treasury of the pharaoh himself. And you know how it goes. If you control the wealth, and everyone believes you speak for the gods, you essentially guide the pharaoh. And their power went way beyond money and politics. They basically monopolized knowledge. Temples contained the Per-Ankh, or the House of Life, which were these vast, incredible libraries preserving sacred texts. The priests were the ultimate intellectuals of their day, masters of astronomy, mathematics, and theology. They were also the doctors. Temple clinics functioned as centers of healing, where priest doctors blended highly advanced herbal remedies, like the ones we found in the famous Ebers Papyrus, with magical incantations to treat illnesses. They were literally the scientists and the sorcerers all rolled into one. Which brings us to Section 6, the fall of the priests, the end of an era. Because no empire lasts forever, and we can chart a definitive end for these ancient guardians. This collapse definitely didn't happen overnight. Around 1350 BCE, a rogue pharaoh named Akhenaten tried to strip their power by forcing a monotheistic religion on the country, but the priests eventually bounced back. By the Third Intermediate Period, starting in 1069 BCE, they actually hit the absolute zenith of their political power. But centuries later, during the Late Period, corruption really started creeping in. Sacred priestly offices were literally being sold to the highest bidder, which completely weakened the institution. Finally, by the 4th century CE, with the rapid rise of Christianity across the empire, the traditional temples lost their funding, they lost their followers, and eventually they simply disappeared into the sands. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. For thousands of years, these priests were absolutely convinced that if they stopped their daily rituals, the sun wouldn't rise and chaos would consume the world. Well, eventually the temples went dark, the chants stopped, and you know what? The sun still rose. The universe didn't end, and the Nile kept gently flowing beneath the ancient stars, bringing life to the ordinary farmers just like it always had. But the magnificent universe of ancient Egypt certainly ended. Or did it just transform, leaving behind this incredible legacy of knowledge, art, and monumental architecture that still completely captivates us today? It's definitely something to think about the next time you see the sunrise. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope you learned something fascinating.